I never imagined that the moment that would split my life into before and after would be a silence. Not a word, not a dramatic gesture, not the kind of confrontation you rehearse in your head for years, waiting for it to happen. No, it was a silence. Specific, lingering, heavy with something I didn't know how to name yet. My name is Lucas Ferreira. I'm 24 years old. And that silence happened in the farmhands' quarters at Mendonça Farm, late one November afternoon, while I was changing with my back to the door, and someone walked in without knocking. Someone who should have apologized and left immediately. Someone who stayed. Have you ever been in one of those situations where time seems to pause? Where you feel that if you turn around, everything will change. But if you stay still, the moment will pass, and you won't have to make any decisions. I stayed still, waiting for him to leave. Except he didn't. The story I'm going to tell you today isn't just about what happened in that room. It's about what happens when you spend your whole life learning not to look at something, and suddenly, that thing is leaning against your wall, looking at you. It's about courage, about the kind of acceptance that doesn't fit into a pretty sentence, about what it means to finally see yourself, even when everything around you taught you that seeing was dangerous. I grew up in a place where men don't talk about how they feel. It's not cruelty, it's just the code. You learn to work, to carry, to solve. You learn to be useful. Feelings are something you keep in a drawer, under the covers, locked in the same part of yourself that no one visits. For years, I thought I was good at this game, that I had tamed something inside me that others couldn't. And then he arrived. Rafael Mendonça, the boss's son. 27 years old, with an agronomy degree from Belo Horizonte, returning to a farm that didn't know what to do with him anymore. But that comes later. First, you need to understand who Lucas Ferreira was before Rafael Mendonça leaned against the wall of the farmhands' quarters and looked at me as if he were recognizing something I didn't even know existed myself. Because the story doesn't start in that room. It starts much earlier. It starts with the smell of leather and wet earth on a farm in the countryside of Minas Gerais. On the first morning, I woke up staring at a ceiling that wasn't mine and knew, somehow, that I had finally arrived somewhere. Even if that place wasn't for me. Even if I was the kind of man who gets to work at 5 in the morning and leaves after sunset, leaving no trace, never asking for more than what was agreed. So, stay with me. Because this story deserves to be told right. And because maybe, just maybe, you know this silence too. Before Mendonça Farm, I had 3 jobs. The first was at a packaging warehouse when I was 17. Night shifts, minimum wage, colleagues who didn't remember my name after 3 months. The second was at a construction site in Montes Claros, basic laborer, hauling materials, mixing concrete, learning to shut up and show up early. The third was at another, smaller farm that went under at the end of a dry year that dried up not only the pasture, but the owner's pockets as well. Every place taught me something. The warehouse taught me that anonymity is armor. Construction taught me that an aching body is still a useful body. And the bankrupt farm taught me that everything that seems solid can turn to dust if the rain doesn't come at the right time. When I arrived at Mendonça Farm, I was 21 years old, with a backpack containing 2 changes of clothes, a pocket knife that belonged to my grandfather, and no expectations that didn't fit inside those 2 items. Mr. Antonio Mendonça came to meet me at the entrance. A tall man, broad-shouldered even at 54, the kind of silhouette you see at dusk against the sun and immediately understand who's in charge. He looked me up and down, shook my hand with the strength of someone sizing you up, and simply asked, "Do you know how to work?" I said yes. "Then you'll do just fine here." That was it. No speech, no tour, no ceremonial introduction. A veteran employee showed me the farmhand's quarters, 4 bunk beds, a small window overlooking the pasture, a fan that ran 2 speeds slower than necessary, and told me breakfast was at 5:30, that Toninho would tell me where lunch was, and that Mr. Antonio didn't like lateness or too much chatter on the job. The Toninho. You'll get to know Toninho better later, but let me give you the right picture now. 38 years old, a belly that had appeared in the last 5 years and had no plan of leaving, and a mustache he groomed with a seriousness he didn't apply to anything else in life. A veteran hand, he'd been on the farm for over 12 years. He knew everything, talked about everything, laughed at everything, and from him, I learned that humor was the daily currency there. You laugh, you belong. Simple as that. From Mr. Antonio, I learned that work was the other currency. You deliver, you stay. You fail, you leave. There was no malice in it. It was just the math of the place. And I was good at math. In the 3 years that passed before Rafa arrived, I became the kind of farmhand the boss mentions by name when talking to other ranchers. Lucas does that job. Leave it to Lucas. It wasn't affection, it was trust. But for me, at that point in my life, trust was worth more than affection. Because affection came with questions, with expectations, with the kind of proximity I didn't know how to manage without betraying something inside me that had been quiet in the back of my mind since I was, I don't know, 15. Do you know what it's like to know something about yourself without ever putting it into words? It's not denial. Denial is when you actively fight against the truth. This was different. It was more like not opening the drawer. The drawer exists. You know it exists. You walk past it every day. But as long as it's closed, you don't have to deal with what's inside. For 3 years at Mendonça Farm, I walked past that drawer every single day. Toninho was married. He talked about his wife with that same mix of complaining and adoration that the men there used to show they loved someone. The other ranch hands had girlfriends, kids, weekend stories. I'd stay quiet in those moments, a smile here, a nod there, the kind of involvement that doesn't require you to offer anything real about yourself. No one asked, and I didn't offer. That was the architecture of my existence on the farm, being present enough to be reliable, discreet enough to be ignored in the parts that mattered. It worked for 3 years, and then, one October afternoon, a car with Belo Horizonte plates pulled onto the dirt road of Mendonça Farm, kicking up a cloud of dust that took about 2 minutes to settle, and Mr. Antonio's son stepped out of the driver's seat. I was fixing the fence in the south pasture when I heard the engine. I didn't look up immediately. I kept working. It was the kind of discipline I'd developed, not looking at what was none of my business. But there are times when your eyes wander on their own. And when mine did, they found Rafael Mendonça leaning against the hood of the car, listening to his father speak, with an expression I couldn't quite read from the distance where I stood. I packed up my tool. I went back to work. But that day, the drawer began to seem like something different than it had always been. No longer just a drawer, a door. Look, when you work in a place for 3 years, you learn to feel the changes before you see them. The farm has a rhythm. It's not the rhythm of a clock. It's the rhythm of the place. The cows, the dogs, the sound the wind makes as it passes through the old fence on the east side. The time Mr. Antonio turns on the office light. The time Toninho finishes his coffee and begins his daily round of complaining. You learn this rhythm, and it becomes your rhythm. You are more the farm than you are yourself. And then someone arrives, and the rhythm stumbles. Rafael Mendonça had spent 6 years in Belo Horizonte, 4 studying agronomy, plus 2 more that Toninho described as just staying out there, with the air of someone who didn't need to finish the sentence because everyone understood what he meant. Except, I wasn't sure I understood what Tonino meant. The farm knows everything before you do. Not because people gossip well, they do gossip, but it's not just that. It's that, in a small place, someone's absence is as visible as their presence. And Rafa had been an absence for 6 years, an absence that Mr. Antonio never mentioned in a positive light. The boy went to study, was all he'd say when anyone asked. Period. Nothing about coming back. Nothing about the future. A full stop that felt more like, this isn't up for discussion. But then he came back. On the second day after Rafa arrived, I saw him up close for the first time. He was on the porch of the main house when I passed by, with a tool cart early in the morning. He looked at me. I looked back by reflex, the kind of look confirming presence that you give anyone on the job. But his lasted a second longer than necessary. Just a second. It's nothing, right? A second too long in a glance. You could be making it up. You could be projecting. You could be turning the drawer into a door, when really it's just a drawer, with a slightly loose hinge. I told myself, it's just a second. Keep working. I did. But in the days that followed, I started noticing other things. The way Rafa walked around the farm was different from how the boss's son usually walks. There was none of the arrogance I expected, the kind of territory marking that becomes a habit for those who grow up on large estates. He walked like someone who is relearning the space, like someone who left and came back and realizes they no longer fit in the same way they did before. Sometimes I'd see him standing in the middle of the corral, just watching, sometimes by the north pasture fence, hand on the wood, eyes on the horizon. There was something about how he inhabited the silence that I can't quite explain. It was different from Mr. Antonio's silence, which was the silence of someone who doesn't need to speak because they've already decided everything. Rafa's silence was that of someone still trying to figure out what to decide. Have you ever felt that? The difference between the silence of someone who has arrived and the silence of someone who is still arriving. The tension with Mr. Antonio was visible during meals. I knew this because of how Tonino would tell me, using that voice of someone who has privileged access to information. The two of them spent half an hour in the living room last night, he told me one afternoon while we were fixing a gate, and neither of them was laughing when they came out. He made that dramatic pause of someone who knows the info carries weight. Mr. Antonio wants the boy to take over the management side. The boy wants to change everything. I didn't say anything. I kept working on the gate. That boy came back from the city different, huh? Tonino concluded, with the tired certainty of someone who thinks they already understand everything about everyone. I didn't ask what he meant by different. Not because I didn't know, but because asking would mean admitting I was listening more than I should have. Which brings me to the end of Rafa's second week at the ranch. Late afternoon, Wednesday, late November. A dry heat that doesn't let up even after the sun goes down. I'd spent all day in the south pasture fixing that same damn fence that seems to grow crooked again every time you straighten it. I was sweaty, dusty. My shirt literally stuck to my back. I got to the bunkhouse. The others were still working. I knew I had about 20 minutes before anyone showed up. I went in, left the door ajar for some air, and took off my shirt. And this was when life decided to stop making room for the drawer. The sound was minimal, a door yielding slowly, a footstep, and then a pause. I was facing away, digging through the locker for a clean shirt, when I felt it. I didn't hear it. I felt it. That kind of awareness the body has, before the mind does, when someone enters a space you were treating as your own. I turned around. Rafael Mendonça was standing about 6 feet away from me. His eyes went to my face first. Then they drifted down. Not in a lewd way, It was something more direct than that, more honest, almost involuntary, like someone who tried not to look, but their eyes went there anyway. For a second, I expected I would say something, or that he would. He didn't. And I found that I wasn't going to either. You have to understand what that silence did to time. Because a 1-second silence is just a second. A 5-second silence starts to feel heavy. A 10-second silence between two men in a closed room where neither makes the obvious move to leave. That silence has weight. You can almost reach out and touch it. Rafa took a step back, but he didn't leave. He leaned against the wall next to the door. The wall, not the door. Someone leaning against the door is on their way out. Someone leaning against the wall next to it is staying. I stood there, clean shirt in hand, my heart doing a job that wasn't in its contract. I felt the heat rise up the back of my neck, not from the sun, but from the kind of attention you didn't know you were waiting to receive. He was looking at me, not aggressively, not in a way I knew how to file into any of the categories I had for these situations. It was a look of recognition, as if he were identifying something, as if I were a question he'd finally found the answer to. I forced my eyes up to the ceiling, then to the floor, then back to him, because staring at the floor felt like a confession, and I didn't have the vocabulary for any confession yet. Rafa opened his mouth, closed it. The fan in the corner made that sound only old fans make, that low hum I'd always ignored, but in that moment, it sounded like the loudest noise in the world. When he finally spoke, all he said was, "Sorry, I didn't know anyone was here." His voice was controlled, but there was something in it, a tiny hesitation, the kind of gap that exists between what you want to say and what you've decided is safe to say. I could have said, "No problem," and let him leave. That's what I should have done. It was the right, polite answer that would have dissolved the tension without leaving a trace. I just nodded. Rafa pushed off the wall, took a step toward the door, paused. There was something about the way he stopped. It wasn't because he forgot something, or a stumble, it was deliberate, as if he'd made a small decision right then and there. He turned back to me once more. "Lucas, right?" He knew my name. It wasn't surprising. He must have heard it from his father, or the others. But hearing my name in his voice, at that specific moment, in that specific room, with that specific distance between us, did something to my chest that I can't describe with any word that wouldn't sound like an exaggeration. "Yeah," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He nodded once, that kind of nod that isn't agreement, but more like acknowledgement, like he was registering something. And then he left. The door closed behind him with the same care it had opened with. I stood in the center of the room for about 30 seconds without moving. Clean shirt still in hand, blood pulsing fast in my temples, with the completely absurd and completely real feeling that something I had carefully tucked away for years had been seen, not touched, not named, not confirmed in any way I could present as evidence, just seen. And I didn't know if it was relief or the start of something I couldn't stop. I put on my shirt, sat on the edge of the bunk. I looked out the window, toward the pasture, that small window I'd looked through hundreds of times without seeing anything in particular. That afternoon, the pasture looked different. It's not crazy. It's not an exaggeration. It's just what happens when something that was inside of you is, for the first time in your life, reflected back by someone else. You get the first proof that you exist. I had spent 24 years being Lucas Ferreira, reliable ranch hand, discreet employee, the man who shows up early, leaves late, and doesn't cause trouble. In that room, on that November afternoon, with Rafael Mendonça leaning against my wall for no more than 2 minutes. I had the strange and disconcerting feeling that it was the first time someone had truly seen me. And that wasn't the part that scared me. The part that scared me was that I had liked it. That a part of me, the part that lived in that drawer I never opened, had been satisfied. Like someone who was waiting for exactly that, without knowing they were waiting. What was I going to do with this feeling? The safest, most reasonable, most adult answer was nothing. Absolutely nothing. Work the next day like always. Don't look longer than I should. Don't read into a single extra second of a gaze anything that wasn't just an illusion of my own head. I decided that was it. Except the decisions we make in the bunkhouse on a late November afternoon are rarely the ones we manage to keep when the sun rises again. For the next 3 days, I became a ghost. Not in the sense that I stopped working. Working was what I knew how to do, what kept me sane. But I became the kind of presence that occupies a space without truly inhabiting it. I'd arrive early, finish late, and choose the tasks furthest from the main house. If there was a chance to be in 2 places, and one of them had less of a chance of crossing paths with Rafael Mendonça, I chose that one. It worked for a day. On the second day, he showed up where I was fixing the water trough in the north pasture. He didn't say anything immediately. He just leaned against the fence with his arms crossed, staring at the same horizon I was pretending to study. After about 2 minutes, he asked something about the valve in the water system. A technical, reasonable question. The kind of thing a future farm manager really should know. I answered, in professional Lucas's voice. The Lucas who knows about faucets and fences, and when the cow from the east pasture is going to give birth. Thanks, he said. I nodded without looking. He stayed a little longer. Not out of necessity. He already had the information he asked for. He stayed for some other reason that neither of us was naming. Then he left. On the third day, he ran into me outside the tool shed. This time he just nodded. I nodded back. I kept walking. On the fourth day, I saw him from a distance and changed direction. Have you ever done that? Changed your entire route to avoid someone you know isn't a danger, who hasn't done anything wrong, but whose mere presence is enough to disrupt something carefully organized inside you? It's exhausting. It's the kind of energy you spend that doesn't show up on any bill, but makes the late afternoon arrive with a weight that doesn't come from the work. I was exhausted. On the inside, things weren't any better. I dreamed about that room twice. Not about anything I could describe, it was more the atmosphere, the heat of that silence, the feeling of being seen without having given permission. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, with my heart racing, and spend about 10 minutes convincing myself there was nothing to have a racing heart about. It worked. Temporarily. It was on the 5th day that Toninho found me at breakfast, with that expression of someone who has information they're going to have a hard time not sharing. I talked to Rafa yesterday, he said, helping himself to beans as naturally as if he were talking about the weather. I replied, focused on my plate. Man, he talked to me for about 20 minutes, asked a bunch of stuff about the farm, about the ranch hands, who does what. Pause. Toninho loved pauses. It was the dramatic punctuation of his communication. He asked about you specifically. I looked up. I shouldn't have, but I did. Asked what? Toninho shrugged with the air of someone who had just won at chess. If you were trustworthy, if his father already let you handle decision-making, management stuff. Another shrug. But he asked about you, not the others. I went back to my plate. It must be because Mr. Antonio used me as a work reference once. Must be, Toninho agreed. And then came, that boy came back different from the city, huh? He has a way, I don't know. More observant than normal. I didn't say anything. Not that it's a bad thing, Tonino added, as if he felt he'd said something that needed mending. It's just that the city changes people, you know. Changes how they look at things. Yeah, I agreed, because that was enough to end the subject. Tonino spent about 2 seconds studying me with that expression of someone getting close to something, without knowing exactly what. And then he changed the subject to a cow in the east pasture that was having trouble, and the moment passed. But it stayed with me all day. That boy came back different from the city, a more observant way. Asked about you specifically. Did I know what that meant? No, not really. It could mean anything. But there was a part of me, the part that had been satisfied in that room, the one I kept under lock and key, that was interpreting it all. And the interpretations were scarier than the scene itself. Because in the scene, I was passive. The scene had happened to me. If Rafa was looking for it, if there was intention there, if something was being built deliberately, then the next scene would involve a choice. And choice is much scarier than an accident. I decided that night. Absolute distance. Polite, professional, but absolute. It was what I could control. It was what would make sense. It was what I'd do until the next day, when Mr. Antonio would change everything, without knowing there was anything to change. Mr. Antonio called for me before breakfast. That only happened when it was something out of the routine. I prepared myself for a complicated task, a sick animal in the field, an infrastructure problem, some visitor who needed logistical support, the kind of thing that requires someone trustworthy. Rafael is going to work with you today, he said. No preamble, no explanation. He needs to learn the fences in the high pasture. Take him with you. There was no room for a refusal. There was no way to construct one without giving a reason. And there was no reason I could give Mr. Antonio that wasn't, deep down, the only real reason. Right, I said. The high pasture was the furthest from the main house. An hour's walk down the dirt road, or 20 minutes in the pickup through the shortcut. I sometimes preferred to walk, just to have time to think. But with Rafa by my side, I didn't take the shortcut. I took the truck. The first 15 minutes were spent in silence. Not the heavy silence of the bedroom. This was the silence of two men who hadn't yet found what to say, which is different, more neutral. But even so, inside the cab of a pickup, with the sun hitting the windshield and the dirt road rattling the suspension, silence takes up a lot of space. Rafa was the one who spoke first. Is 6 years enough time for a city to really change you? I glanced at him. He had his arms crossed, looking out the window at the pasture passing by. Depends on what you take with you to the city, I replied. He turned to me. A small smile, the first one I'd seen up close on him. Good answer. I stayed quiet, but I loosened up a bit. I left because I wanted to. I stayed because I needed more time than I thought. A pause. I came back because my father asked me to, and because I think I needed to see how I felt when I returned. And what did you feel? He was quiet for a second. That the place is still the same, and that I'm not. I knew what he meant. Not exactly. I didn't know the details of his story. But that feeling of being in a familiar space and being too different for it to fit you the same way. That I knew. We reached the high pasture. I got out of the truck. I grabbed the tools. I started the routine. Fence work has a good rhythm for thinking, and a bad rhythm for thinking too. It depends on what you're thinking about. When you're working on a fence with someone else, the labor creates a sort of unspoken contract. You do your part, they do theirs, and in the breaks between the hammer blows, if there's something to be said, it can be said without it sounding like anyone is fishing for attention. Rafa was a good worker. It's not like every rancher's son is, you know. But he knew what he was doing. He'd learned here, years ago, before the city. The movements had muscle memory. We worked for about 2 hours almost in silence, the productive kind this time. And then, during the mid-morning break, he sat in the shade of a tree along the fence line and said, "My father thinks I came back to take over. Actually, he doesn't just think it. He's sure of it." I went to sit some distance away, with the water bottle, waiting. "And are you going to take over?" I asked. "Not the way he wants." He looked toward the horizon, that look I'd noticed right at the start. "He wants me to be him, 20 years younger, and I already know I'm not." There was weight in that. The kind of thing you say when it's taken a long time to work up the courage to say it out loud, even if it's to a near stranger. "Mr. Antonio is a man who knows what he wants," I said carefully. "Yeah, the problem is when what he wants is a version of me that doesn't exist." He paused. "Is your family from around here?" The subject change wasn't an escape. It was genuine curiosity. I could feel it. "Montes Claros. But it's been a long time since I've been back." "Why?" A direct question. Almost uncomfortably direct. "Because the place I left didn't really need me that much," I replied. It was the truth. It just wasn't the whole truth. He looked at me for a moment, and he didn't ask anything else. That respect for another's silence, that ability to hear a half answer and recognize it was the only answer that person could give in that moment, was the first time I felt Rafa saw me as someone with an internal history, not just his father's ranch hand. We got back to work. It was in the late afternoon, with the sun already low and golden over the pasture, when it happened. I was stretching a length of wire in the wrong direction. End-of-day fatigue, a 2-second distraction. Rafa, who was on the opposite side, moved quickly to catch the end before the wire could tension wrongly. We met in the middle. His hand touched mine. Not intentionally, with the mechanical urgency of someone preventing a problem with a wire. But the hand stayed. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Long enough for both of us to know. Then he held the wire. I adjusted it. We finished the job. We headed back to the truck. Neither of us said a word about it. But on the way back, there was a new weight in the silence of the cab. Not the neutral silence from earlier. It was the silence of 2 men who know something and are still deciding what to do with that knowledge. That night, for the first time since Rafa had arrived, I didn't try to convince myself there was nothing to think about. I just lay there on the bunk, staring at the ceiling, and let the thought linger. I had a habit of staying on the back porch after dinner when I couldn't sleep. It wasn't rare. It was the kind of insomnia you get when you have too much of something in a place where you shouldn't have much at all. You just sit there, the sounds of the countryside at night, crickets, the wind, the occasional animal in the distance, and you wait for your own internal noise to quiet down. That night, 3 days after the high pasture, I was on the porch when I heard footsteps in the hallway behind me. Rafa approached silently, carrying 2 glasses. He offered me one. Lemon water, cold, the kind of thing the ranch kitchen always had ready at night. I took it. We stayed in silence for a while, both leaning against the wooden railing, looking into the dark of the fields. "Do you like it here?" he eventually asked. "The ranch?" From the silence, from the distance from everything. I really thought about it before answering. Yes, but not always for the right reason. He looked at me sideways. What would be the wrong reason? Distance from everything includes distance from yourself too. Sometimes you don't know if you like the place, or if you're using the place so you don't have to go anywhere at all. A longer silence. Then, That's a more honest thought than most people up here would be capable of having out loud. I didn't answer. I took a sip from my glass. My father thinks a man who thinks too much about himself is a man who doesn't work enough, Rafa said, with a lightness that didn't completely hide the weight. I know that, Manuel, I said. The version I learned was that feelings are for people who have nothing better to do. Rafa gave a low laugh. Not of mockery, of recognition. Exactly that one. He paused. 6 years in Belo Horizonte were enough for me to unlearn parts of that manual. Not all of them, but important parts. The fields outside did what fields do. They just stayed there, massive, indifferent, full of their own noise. Which parts? I asked. And I realized I really wanted to know. Rafa looked ahead for a moment. Then he said, the part that says, you need to pretend you're not who you are, just to have the right to be in a place. The silence that followed had a brand new texture, distinct from all the previous ones. Because that couldn't be misinterpreted. It wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't a metaphor that could fit 10 different meanings. It was a sentence that said exactly what it said, careful enough not to be a direct declaration, but direct enough not to be anything else. I heard it, and part of me, that repressed side, which now occupied much more space than the name suggested, responded to it in a way that wasn't verbal. But I didn't say anything. The silence on my part was different from the silence of the room. In that room, I hadn't said anything, because I didn't know what to say. Here, there was a clarity that made the silence more deliberate, heavier. Rafa didn't push. He didn't repeat himself. He just stayed there, glass in hand, waiting without seeming like he was waiting. That ability of his to inhabit silence that I had noticed before. What was running through my head were numbers. 3 years of trust with Seu Antonio. A salary that allowed me to exist without owing anyone anything. A place that had given me the only kind of belonging I had managed to build in my adult life. A reputation, discreet, invisible, but solid, as a reliable man. All of that on one side of the scale. And on the other? On the other was something I didn't yet know how to properly name. A possibility, a recognition, the feeling that there was a version of my life I hadn't tried yet. You know things work differently here? I said eventually. My voice came out lower than I intended. I know, he said. I grew up here. Then you know what I'm saying? I do. Pause. I also know that the distance between knowing something is difficult and deciding it's impossible is where most people spend their entire lives. There was no answer for that. I finished my drink, said goodnight. I went inside. I lay in the bunk bed and stared at the ceiling for an hour, maybe more, with Rafa's phrase settling into some permanent place inside me. The distance between knowing something is difficult and deciding it's impossible. I had lived in that distance for 10 years. Was it still the place I wanted to live? I didn't sleep well that night. There's a type of humiliation that isn't intentional. It's the worst kind. Because you can respond to what's intentional. You know where it came from. You know what it is. What isn't intentional exists in a space where you can't do anything, because doing something would be confirming what is being sort of said without really being said. It was during lunch. 5 farmhands around the kitchen table in the workers' quarters. Me, Toninho, and 3 others who worked with the cattle. Lunch talk, the cheap kind. The usual mix of work complaints and bad jokes. Someone mentioned they had seen Rafa and me coming back together from the high pasture earlier that week. They've become a pair, that person said. A tone of nothing, a casual remark. Toninho, with the absolute naturalness of someone who doesn't realize they are stepping into a minefield, added, Lucas has been the boss's golden boy for a long time. Now he's become the sun's golden boy too. Everyone burst out laughing. The kind of laughter that doesn't come from malice. It comes from idleness, from the heat, from the pleasure of having something to say in the middle of a silent table. I pretended to laugh. The kind of expression you put on your face when you need your face to look normal. Inside, something had frozen. Not because Toninho knew. He didn't. It was just Toninho being Toninho, connecting dots that existed in the visible world without having any idea there was an invisible world with other dots. But the fact that there was no intent didn't prevent the sentence from landing on me with the weight of a label. The sun's golden boy. The laughter lasted about 10 seconds. The conversation moved on. Lunch ended. But I carried those 10 seconds with me for the rest of the day, because there was something in them that reminded me of what was at stake. Not in an abstract way, in a concrete way. 5 men around a table, an unintentional phrase, a laugh, and me, in the middle, struggling to look like just one of the guys. That was it. That was exactly what I had trained my whole life to do. And lately, it was costing me more and more energy to maintain. That afternoon, I went to get a tool from the shed and ran into Seu Antonio. Usually, I'd just pass by without stopping. But he called out to me. "Lucas, tomorrow Rafa is leaving for Belo Horizonte, about 5 days there, closing some contracts. I need you to keep an eye on the north pasture in the meantime. That section of the fence is still weak." I said I would. He left without another word. I stood in the shed for a few seconds. 2 days. Rafa was leaving in 2 days. And then it was as if 2 events collided at the same time. The laughter from the lunch table and this information. As if the universe were presenting both sides of the equation to me at once. This is what you lose if you don't stay quiet. This is what you lose if you do. The night was slow to arrive. I made dinner in silence. The kind of silence that Toninho noticed and respected this time. Maybe because even he had a sensor for when Lucas's head was elsewhere. I went to the room early. I just lay there. I thought about Seu Antonio, who had given me the only kind of professional recognition I had received in my adult life. I thought about the farm, which was the only place in 10 years where I had woken up in the morning without a weight on my chest. I thought about the porch, about Rafa's phrase regarding the distance between difficult and impossible. I thought about the farmhand's quarters on a November afternoon, an ajar door, a silence with texture, his hands touching mine over a wire. The way he waited without seeming to be waiting. The way there was something in the way he looked at me that made me feel like I existed in a way that wasn't just about utility. In the morning, Rafa would still be there. The morning after tomorrow, he wouldn't. I closed my eyes, and I stayed there until almost midnight, with the decision in my chest, heavy and hot, like an ember that won't go out. At 11 o'clock at night, I got up. It wasn't a heroic decision. It wasn't the kind of thing you plan in a logical sequence, step 1, 2, 3. It was more the kind of movement that happens when you've reached the limit of how long you can stay still. When the weight of doing nothing starts to be greater than the weight of doing. I got dressed. I didn't think much. If I thought too much, I'd go back to the bunk. I left the quarters. The farm at night has a quality different from anything I've already described. The day's heat stored in the earth. The silence that isn't an absence of sound. It's the presence of other sounds. Crickets, the low wind, the smell of pasture damp with dew. I went to the main house, not through the front door, through the side, where there was a window to the guest room Rafa was using. A light was on. I knocked on the wall. Not the window, the wall beside it. Discreet enough. The light moved. A second later, the window opened. Rafa looked at me without speaking. "I need to talk to you," I said. My voice was low, just enough not to carry inside the house. He nodded once. He grabbed some shoes and came out through the side door. We went to the farmhands' quarters. It hadn't been planned that way. Tonino and the others were sleeping at the back of the farm this week because of an early morning task they had. The room was empty. The same small window, the same 2-speed fan that was 1 speed short of what was needed. The same space where, a few weeks ago, everything had started without either of us making a single decision. This time, the decision was whole. We stood facing each other, with the space between us. I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again. That day, I began. When you walked in here. He stayed quiet, waiting. I knew you weren't going to leave when you leaned against the wall. My voice was steady, but I needed effort to keep it that way. Not immediately, but I knew. And the part that scared me wasn't you staying. It was what I felt when you did. A pause. What was it? He asked. His voice was low, without urgency. He wasn't pressuring me. He was staying with me. As if someone had truly seen me for the first time. And I didn't know what to do with that, because it had never happened before. Rafa was quiet for a while. Then he said, I went in because I thought it was empty. But when I saw it wasn't, I didn't leave because I couldn't. He looked straight at me. It wasn't an oversight. It was the first honest thing I've done since I got here. That landed on me with a kind of weight, different from everything that had landed in the past weeks. I'm scared, I said. And it was the hardest and simplest thing I'd ever said. Me too, he said immediately. No hesitation, none of that theatrical courage that doesn't exist in real life. My father, the farm, what people around here will say. I know all about it. A pause. But it's been years since I stopped letting fear decide for me. And I came back here partly to find out if I could stop letting this place decide too. I have nowhere to go if this goes wrong, I said. The sentence came out with an honesty I hadn't planned. This farm is the only place in 10 years where I've felt competent, useful, where Seu Antonio looks at me and sees someone, not just a disposable worker. I hear you. Rafa took a step toward me. And I can't guarantee that nothing will change, because it might. But I can tell you that whatever happens, any difficult conversation, any negotiation with my father, I won't leave you stranded. That's not what I want from you. The sentence came out before I could catch it. He stayed quiet. I don't want protection, I continued. I want this. What's happening here right now, where neither of us is pretending it isn't happening. Rafa kept looking at me for a long moment, and then he said something I didn't expect. I see you, Lucas. They weren't the words I was expecting, but they were exactly the ones I needed. Because it wasn't about what would happen next. It wasn't about plans or guarantees, or the future of the farm, or what Mr. Antonio would think. It was about the now. About 2 men in a room at 11 at night who finally stopped circling around a truth and decided to step inside it. I see you too, I said. And then there was nothing left to say with words. He moved. I moved. And what happened wasn't the kind of thing you describe in detail, not because it doesn't matter, but because what mattered there wasn't the physical act itself. It was what that act represented. 2 men who chose, in the same space where the accident had happened, to repeat that encounter intentionally, with eyes wide open, with everything that cost included in the choice. We stayed in silence for a long time afterward, sitting on the edge of the bunk bed, shoulder to shoulder, with the small window in front of us and the pasture outside, dark and silent. I'm coming back, he said. Not as a solemn promise, but as a simple fact. I should be in BH for about 5 days. When I get back, we'll figure out how to navigate this. Your father will notice. My father is already noticing that something changed in me since I arrived. He just doesn't know what yet. Pause. When I tell him, it'll be hard. But I've already tried the easy way, and it hasn't worked in 6 years. I stayed quiet. You'll have to decide how much you want to be visible, he continued. I'm not asking you to do anything you don't want to, but I need you to know that on my part, there's no more pretending. I know. And I did. I don't have answers for everything right now. You don't need to. He looked at me. You don't have to be perfect all the time, Lucas. You just need to be honest with me. That sentence stuck. It stuck the way certain sentences do when they arrive at exactly the moment you needed them most, without knowing you did. He left a little before midnight. He went out the same way he came in, discreetly, without drama, with that quality of silence that was uniquely his. I sat on the bunk bed for about 15 minutes after he left. The room was the same. The window was the same. The fan was the same. But there was something different about the way I inhabited the space, as if I had finally arrived somewhere. Rafa left right after breakfast. I watched the truck pull away down the dirt road from the small bedroom window. The cloud of dust it kicked up was the same as always, the kind that takes 2 minutes to settle. The same cloud from when he had arrived, but it wasn't the same scene. I grabbed the tools. I went to the north pasture, as Mr. Antonio had requested. The fence was indeed weak along a 50-meter stretch. Technical work I knew how to do on autopilot, the kind of task that leaves the mind free to go wherever it wants. That morning, I let it. It wasn't the kind of euphoric thought that romance movies suggest it should be. It was more sober than that. It was the kind of thinking that considers things as they are. Mr. Antonio didn't know. But Mr. Antonio was the type of man who notices changes before understanding them. I had learned that in 3 years. At some point, something would catch his attention. A look that lasted a second too long, an observed closeness, a question asked in a tone that wasn't for a casual question. Not today, maybe not this week, but eventually. And then the difficult conversations Rafa had mentioned would come. I didn't romanticize it. Why romanticize? Mr. Antonio was a 54-year-old man, shaped by a code I knew as well as my own. Because it was the same code, the rural code of masculinity that doesn't have much room for what we were. He could react in many different ways. Some of them were ruinous. But as I hammered the stake into the hard ground of the north pasture that morning, I realized something. That I had spent 3 years managing what Mr. Antonio would think. 3 years adjusting every movement, every conversation, every visible choice on the farm, according to what would preserve the image I knew he wanted to see. And it had worked. I was good at it. Only the cost of that competence was that I had disappeared inside it. Not completely, but in essential parts. In the middle of the day, Mr. Antonio passed by the north pasture in his truck. Routine check. He did it a few times a week. He stopped, got out, and came to look at the work. Good work, he said. Same as always, with the same economy of words as always. I nodded, same as always. But there was a subtle change in the way I received that. Not that the recognition was worth less. It still was. Mr. Antonio was a man of his word, a boss who did what he agreed to, and his approval was real and well-deserved. But for the first time, I received that sentence without it weighing as the only thing keeping me standing. There was something else keeping me standing now. I went to dinner. I sat near Tonino, who was in his usual monologue about something that had happened in the east pasture. I answered at the right times. I ate what there was to eat. Only this time, when Tonino spoke and I responded automatically, I was present in a different way. Not with fear, not with constant vigilance, just present. It's hard to explain the difference, but it's real. Before, being there was about not being seen, about occupying space without leaving a trace, about being useful without being vulnerable. Now, I was there because that place had value, yes, but that value was no longer the only reason for me to exist. There was a version of me that existed beyond the fence, beyond the pasture, beyond the boss's approval. There was someone who had said, "I see you," and who would be back in 5 days. It wasn't an end to the problem. It wasn't a clean resolution. It was just the beginning of a more honest chapter, harder in some ways, but irresistibly more real. And it had been a long time since I'd been in anything that was truly real. This story doesn't have a tidy ending. Mr. Antonio still exists. The farm still exists. The code still exists. Everything I described as a burden is still a burden. It didn't go away just because 2 people sat on the edge of a bunk bed one November night and decided to stop pretending. But there's a difference between weight you carry without knowing you're carrying it, and weight you've chosen to carry with your eyes wide open. The first one bends you without you realizing it. The second, you distribute differently. You breathe under it differently. It's the same weight, but you're no longer the same person underneath it. My name is Lucas Ferreira. I'm 24 years old, and I've spent most of them learning to be invisible in the parts that mattered most. I'm not going to say that everything is fine now. It's not, and it would be wrong to say it is. But I can say, and it's the hardest and most important thing I've ever said out loud, that I can no longer live in that old silence. That the version of me that fit perfectly in the drawer has become too small. Do you know that silence? Do you have a drawer that won't open? A weight you distribute differently depending on who's watching? A version of yourself that only appears when no one you need to impress is around? You don't need to name it now. You don't need to label or define it. You just need to know that silence isn't protection. It's a cost. And that there's a difference between choosing not to speak and having no choice at all. If you related to any part of this story, tell me in the comments. I want to know how you're doing. I want to know what this story touched in you. If it was helpful, leave a like. You help me continue bringing real, psychologically honest stories that talk about what people feel but rarely say. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters. And see you tomorrow. Much love, everyone.